Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this today's seminars webinar jointly organized by URBACT and Urban Innovative Action to launch the online platform on the activity Cities Engaging on the Right to Housing. My name is Raffaele Barbato. I'm the project coordinator at the Urban Innovative Action Secretariat. And today I will be co-moderating this webinar together with my colleague at URBACT, Nuala Morgan, who is the head of the capitalization and communication unit at URBACT. Hi, Nuala.
Hi, Raffaele, and good morning, everyone.
So today we are particularly happy and excited to host this webinar, and this is for several reasons. First of all, because with today's seminar we are reaching a quite important milestone of a process that has been lasting for more than 1 year. Actually, we launched this joint activity in Porto at the city forum last January, and this has a rather symbolical meaning, because basically this was for many of us the last opportunity that we had to meet in person and to attend physically an event dedicated to urban development in Europe. But this is not only the main reason. We are also particularly happy because this 1 year and a half of journey that we have been doing together has been punctuated by 3 main digital events that have been looking at the 3 main, let's say, dimensions of the right to housing that we have identified to structure this activity. We have been looking at collaborative housing, and then we have been discussing and looking at the inclusiveness and the fairness of the housing markets. Those 3 main events, 3 moments, have generated, I believe, a great wealth of knowledge, which has been captured in a variety of outputs. We have videos, we have articles, we have podcasts, and now we have also a final report. All those outputs, all this knowledge is now gathered in a single platform, which we are happy to launch today. But so far, we have also been able already to share those contents throughout the different communication channel. And we have seen that those have already generated a great attention and interest by a variety of urban stakeholders in Europe that are active and working on the right to housing. So without further saying, I would like just to show you how we have organized today's webinar. So please, next slide. In a few seconds, I will give the floor to our lead expert, Laura Collini, who will be presenting us the journey of this activity. So she will be presenting us the main activities, but even more importantly, she will be presenting us the main learning, the main findings that we have been able to capture and generate along this 1 year and a half journey. After Laura, we have the great pleasure to have with us Professor David Madden from the London School of Economics, who will be providing us with a keynote speech setting the scene about the concept of right to housing, specifically in a post-pandemic context. After this setting the scene, after the keynote speech by Professor Madden, we will be entering into different but very much interlinked conversation. First of all, we will start discussing with 2 of the cities that we have been featuring in this activity. So we have the pleasure to have with us a representative from the city of Lisbon, Portugal, and a representative from the city of Ghent, Belgium. So this will be a first conversation, let's say, looking at the city perspective, at the city level, and then we will move to the European level, where we will have the chance to learn more about 2 major policy developments that have been happening over the last month. First of all, from the point of view of the Portuguese presidency of the European Union, and then from the European Parliament. We will then close this webinar with some conclusive remarks. First of all, from the European Commission. We have with us Maria Hapaka, Policy Officer at the DG for Regional and Urban Policy of the European Commission. And then myself and Nula will also be sharing with you some conclusive remarks at the very end of the seminars. So without, probably just before giving the floor to Laura, let me just recall you a couple of, let's say, housekeeping rules, which I'm sure you are all familiar with after such a long experience of webinars all over this more than 1 year. So first of all, as you know, by default, your camera and your mic will be switched off. And then, but in the meantime, we would also like to have as much as possible interactivity during this webinar. To do so, there are two functions that are proposed by Zoom. We have the chat function and the Q&A function. So what's the difference? Basically, we would like you to use the chat function just to make any type of comments or to post references or links to project or publication that you believe are relevant for today's conversation. Whereas we would like you to use the Q&A function to post your questions. Those questions will be checked out and answered as much as possible by the different speakers, either during the dedicated Q&A session that we have after each presentation, or to the limit of possible by the speakers during the whole conversation. For those questions that we won't be able to reply during the webinar, we will try to, of course, save those questions and ensure some kind of follow-up after the webinar. So this is all from my side. I give the floor now to Laura to walk us through the journey that we have been doing together for more than 1 year. Laura, the floor is yours. Laura, you are muted.
Okay, seems I've never used Zoom before, no? Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Raffaele. My name is Laura Collini. I'm an independent researcher and I work for URBACT and UIA, and I've been collaborating with a large team for bringing this project to life. So I would like to start our conversation today with telling you sort of an anecdote, because we are all caught in this kind of new fluidity of space of working and dwelling and living in the same apartments with our familiar people all the time. And my son, I share this apartment with my son, and he was studying history the other day. And so he was studying Imperial Rome. And I found out that being the megalopoly of the past and ancient time, Rome had the majority of inhabitants paying an exorbitant rent, and where the rental costs in Rome were 4 times higher than the rest of the city. There were no control in terms of caps or control in the, as we will speak today. But interesting enough, there were sort of real estate agents. They were called extractor. So a sort of pre-form of what we call today of financial capitalism in terms of extracting value and capitals from the housing sector. I look at this example because in a certain way, we have a similar phenomenon. When we look at today a housing overburden cost in Europe, so as much as that was happening in that time, we see that there are differences from rural areas and the urban center. In ancient Rome, the cost was 4 times higher than in the rural areas, I was saying. The average rent increase in 10 years peaks in some countries like in Estonia, but it's steadily growing in Europe. And also we have house prices that are steadily growing with peaks that are not recorded here and are differentiated in cities and countries. So if we look at the situation today, the data, we don't have this kind of data from the past, but we see that 10 years time has produced in Europe more than 70% of people sleeping rough. And every night that we sleep in our comfortable house and homes, we have 700 people that are sleeping rough in emergency accommodation. This is all due to an historic chronic inadequacy of housing, and also to structural strategies of dispossession and displacement, as we will call it today. This is due to many different reasons that we call today call renovation, gentrification, eviction in terms of phenomena, but very much due to an equation, which is the faith on the real estate market and the abandonment of the role of governments in different scales in securing housing rights.
Laura?
Yes.
Laura, sorry for interrupting you. You have a tab, a colors tab on the screen, which appears as well, so people cannot see the right side of your screen.
Color tab.
Yeah.
Do you see it better now?
No, it's actually on the right side of the screen. There's a tab open.
Ah, okay.
You see? Yeah.
The color
Great.
tab. Okay.
Great. So, sorry.
Yeah, thanks for telling me. Yeah, so I was saying that there is this chronic inadequacy of housing. But what is important, and that's why I think that's one of the reasons we launched this activity, it's that we don't think that this chronic crisis of housing is inevitable and is unstoppable. And also we call the idea of creating this initiative, which is a small initiative in a sea of many other initiatives that are happening at European level and beyond. People organized in social movements, tenant associations, but also we have in Europe, and it's very important that we had in this initiative the support of International Union of Tenants, FEANSA, Housing Europe, all these organizations that are lobbying at European level to make sure that the right to housing is taken on board at government at different levels, and also in the daily work of many people that are concerned with housing rights. And then we started to have this, we thought of having this initiative also very much inspired by the fact that the EU Urban Agenda in 2016 was started with a thematic focus on housing. And at that time, everybody was repeating somehow that Europe doesn't have a mandate. And we have seen in the course of 5 years' time that things haven't changed in the sense that it still doesn't have a mandate, but there are more and more focus on housing rights and housing issues, and very much on the top of the agenda, especially today with the Portuguese presidency and after the resolution of the MEP on the report on adequate housing. And while when we thought of launching this idea, which is very much geared at providing exchange of knowledge among cities, we thought of doing it online because we could reach out people that usually were not sitting at tables with a European familiar language. So people from all sorts of backgrounds or interests that could join online. And it was before the pandemic that everything happened. And we were sort of blown up also work-wise by the new situation, and also changed the way we approach the topic on housing. And we looked at different measures and mechanisms, relief mechanisms that governments at different levels also brought forward. Suspension of eviction, the federal rental payment, many of these measures that have been imagined impossible, that have been called impossible, became possible during the during the pandemic for urgency matter. But we also know that this is not the full picture, because although eviction bans were in place and the moratoria have been implemented in different ways, evictions still took place. We are now seeing more and more studies that show that there is an association, a direct link between evictions and COVID incidents of mortalities or incidents of death, as I was saying. But also we see that there are like new, although we all somehow appreciate and thank for the presence of moratorium bans and that we're seen implementing, but there are many people that are fighting against them. Like the case in the USA, the National Association of Realtors has used the federal scale for the bans. And so this is a very problematic situation that needs further attention to see how the post-pandemic right to housing is going to develop. And that's why I'm very thankful for David for following up this discussion afterwards. As I was hinting before, the European Commission, although it doesn't have a mandate, has many influences, may influence in many different ways the way local municipalities and obviously member states can invest on housing and in the supply of public social housing as well. There are different funding that can be used, and I think I have sympathy for those sitting at different governments level to find out, to weigh finding a fragmented fragmented source of of funding as well, to put together to really make sure that there is more investment in the supply of public and social housing. I don't just go through all of them, but because the slides will be online. And I just moved to the presentation of the platform. The platform is a way to showcase the example and the practices and experiment, I would say, that cities joining the 2 European programs are developing. For organizational matters, we divide them into 3 topics on definancialization of the housing sector, case studies about the social inclusion, another another thematic on collaborative housing. When you go on the platform, you will have a brief definition or brief explanation of the thematic areas, and then you will find very interesting, I would say, case studies, like the case of the Mataró, which was presented some in the past in one of our conference, the tenant cooperative at city level. We have the case of Ghent, which will be presented afterwards. We have 2 intervention of the city of Ghent, also with a network, it's called Roof Network, URBACT network, that is working on achieving zero homelessness and affordable housing for all, investing on data collection and on housing first in their exchange of knowledge among, I think, 11 cities or 10 cities in the same network. We also have the case of a community land trust, Calico, but is not only community land trust, is an intergenerational collaborative, feminist and care-oriented co-managed housing. It is put in the area of collaborative housing, but could be connected in many others. Every section has a podcast. For the one on financialization, we have Raquel Ronique, the UN Special Rapporteur on housing. Some of them are not online yet, so we will be populating the platform in the course of time. And this one with the collaborative housing, we have Florian Schmidt, Stadtbaurat in Berlin, is talking more broadly about the situation of Berlin. And I think it's quite an interesting podcast to listen to. And this is the recording of the conference that we had during the year. And last but not least, I would like to open the next discussion looking at the tension between the responses with the urgent measures that are called due to the pandemic, and to prepare to long-term investment. And also a very important point is how to reinforce the accountability on communities and movements that are fighting on housing precarities, and how to reinforce these accountabilities at different level of governments. There will be a growing demand for public and adequate and affordable housing in the future. So we all are called to work from different corners of our working lives to also engage in this aspect. And last but not least, I would like to share a big thanks to all the listeners, the organizers and the volunteers that dedicated the free time to bring forward this little platform, but it's way more than a platform, because it put together like 2 big European programs, also the EU Urban Agenda, a lot of people that were not before working together, and also they experimented this collaborative work. And it was not an easy task, I would say, to do so, but I think that it was a pilot that opened the floor to other hopefully similar initiative in the EU, the Urban Initiative that we'll be talking afterwards. And a special thanks to all that personally contributed, Raffaele, Noalia, Amelia, Alice, Amy, Nula, Ophelie, Levente, Ruth Owen, and my dear colleague Ivan Tosic, and also the media that put this platform online. So I'm not very able to speak as a being televised online, because it's really, even though we do all of these Zooms and we are privileged of sitting at home and doing this Zoom, but it's really very pressing also to tell a lot of thoughts and reflection in this format. So thank you very much for listening and for your patience. I give the floor to the next speaker. So I would like to stop my my presentation, and I would like to leave the floor to Professor David Madden. Professor David Madden is Associated Professor in Sociology and co-director of the Cities program, and he works on urban studies, political sociology, and social theory. His research interests include housing, public space, urban restructuring, and critical urban theory. He co-authored with Peter Marcuse's a very nice and fantastic book, I would say, In Defense of Housing, The Politics of Crisis, edited by Verso in 2016. And we kindly asked Professor Madden to give us this perspective on the post-pandemic crisis and the right to housing. So thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. That is very kind, and it's great to see this platform being rolled out and to see this discussion, because as I'll be saying, I think this is an absolutely crucial moment for housing politics and really for housing history, as different housing regimes and different relationships between housing and the rest of the economy and the rest of citizenship gets reconfigured. So I think it's a really important moment to be having this conversation. I'm going to share my screen here so you can follow along with a few very wordy slides. Apologies for that, but yes, okay, everyone should be able to see this now. So I want to start with this image here, which isn't directly related to the post-pandemic right to housing. It's a few years ago this photo was taken, but I think that it says something, captures something about the relationship and the sort of intersection between architecture, citizenship, and domestic life. This is a mural by the street artist Stick, who's a sort of well-known street artist and sort of graffiti artist in London, and it's on the side of what is clearly a council housing block. I think this image of a parent and child really speaks to the need for the state to attend to actual family life and sort of residential need while thinking about housing, and this sort of need to build a an urban environment that takes this into account. I think it also shows what's at stake in these discussions, because this block was demolished as part of a wave of demolitions of housing estates across London, and it's no longer standing. So I think looking at this now also speaks to the fact that the right to housing can be rolled back, can be undermined, can be removed. So it's just a picture I'd like us to begin with. I'm not going to be telling anyone here anything that you don't know. You're all experts in housing. You're all deeply involved in housing. You know what the issues are. And I'm also not going to be trying to outline a platform, because there already is an excellent platform on the table, as Laura has discussed. Instead, I just want to talk a bit about how we think about these issues, about the politics of housing, about the framing of the right to housing, and about this political moment. I think that this is a time when housing systems in many places really could go in two directions. We could either see a deepened and strengthened and broadly substantiated right to housing being established in many places, and you clearly see different groups and different administrations moving in that direction. Or you could see a more deeply financialized, more precarious type of housing system emerging in many places, and you also see beginnings of that. So this is an exciting moment, but it is not one that's without its risks. I think that the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic make a real right to housing more important and necessary than ever. And it is an opportunity to really establish and deepen the right to housing. But as I said, this is also a moment when there are a number of sort of risks and hazards for housing activists, for housing movements, for housing managers and people involved with housing. So I'm going to be sort of drawing on some of these pieces that I've been writing recently and some of my thinking here as I make these points. But as I said, this is no surprise to anyone that this is a very fraught moment, and that's because the pandemic, when it arrived in cities, it arrived in cities that were already facing a housing crisis. Just to sort of outline some of the major points here about what we talk about when we talk about housing crisis. Almost every big city was facing issues with unaffordability and inaccessibility. So housing was unaffordable. For different groups, it was inaccessible. And this is not only the private rented sector. This is also owner occupation. In some cases, this is social housing or housing associations. So across different tenures, there are issues with unaffordability. There are issues with inaccessibility. In many cities, increasing numbers of households were living precariously, were facing insecurity. They had either insufficient tenancy rights, or they faced homelessness or other issues. There are many different examples of precarity and embodiments of precarity, and you saw this in many different forms in many different places. In especially centers of cities, but in other places, other locations as well, within urban regions, many households faced displacement driven by different factors, and communities faced displacement. So you have multi-scalar displacement. I mean, displacement of households from neighborhoods, displacements of communities from districts and from municipalities. And this was another process that is contributing to precarity and unaffordability. And there's also what some social theorists and political economists call a crisis of care and a crisis of social reproduction that was really congealing within housing. So households increasingly were poorly equipped to maintain themselves and to reproduce everyday life. So the housing system was putting pressures on families, making just the sort of maintenance and reproduction of domestic life on an everyday basis more difficult. And you can see this in all sorts of symptoms of mental health. You can see this in different economic indicators. It is a sort of complex problem that is not restricted to the housing sphere, but is something that is certainly central to the housing question and central to the housing problem. All of these symptoms of the housing crisis were driven by a number of complicated factors. And this is just the barest, broadest outline. I mean, the growth of wealth inequality and income inequality in general, and this is something that was uneven, that is racialized, that intersects with other inequalities as well, inequalities about national status, gender inequality, many other different forms of inequality are sort of driving these symptoms of housing crisis. This is something that is driven by privatization of social housing and the neoliberalization of the state in many different areas. So not only the transformation of housing systems specifically, but also rollback of welfare rights and social services and many different elements that are connected to this process called neoliberalization. And as well, financialization and restructuring of real estate capital. We see new economic actors becoming ever more prominent within the housing system. So, we see the emergence of private equity firms as major players in housing systems. We all know about firms like Blackstone, which is the largest owner of housing in the world, but there are many other operators like that. We see the transformation of home finance. We see a number of different processes that have been linked to this idea of financialization. This too is driving the housing crisis. So this was all happening before the pandemic. And when the pandemic begins, obviously it's understood as a sort of health event, as an event within the health system, but it's also absolutely something that is about housing, that is shaped by the housing system, that is reshaping the housing system. And I think it's this sort of interface between the pandemic and housing that provides this sort of shock that's creating this moment when housing politics could really transform. So, I mean, again, I think the term post-pandemic implies obviously that the pandemic is over, and that is quite presumptuous and factually incorrect. Of course, it's still unfolding and still happening. But I think that already we can see that it is impacting the housing system and the housing question in a number of important ways. And these are elements of the pandemic that are not, they're not sort of directly biotic or viral, but these are essential parts of the story here and essential parts of what's happening, the sort of residential determination of health here. So in many places, you have seen the prioritization of rentiers over workers. So people have been on furlough, they have not been able to work in various ways. There have been huge numbers, obviously, of layoffs and job loss. But for the most part, the rent has continued to accrue. And in most countries, obviously there have been some steps to protect tenants, but there's never a sense in which if you can't work, then you don't have to pay the rent. And there's never a sense in which landlords and rentiers need to be absorbing more of the economic pain relative to workers. And I think this sort of prioritization of rent over work is a really important factor for sort of shaping how cities are going to be in the near future. This is something that you see in residential urban spaces as well as commercial urban spaces. And this is also something that's reshaping high streets and downtown areas in many places. But so you've got the prioritization of rentiers over workers. Connected to that, there is, as I'm sure you all know, huge buildup of rent arrears and also of mortgage debt. And again, this is something that has been sort of managed in some ways through eviction moratoria, through different deals that banks have cut. It has largely been determined privately, I think, in most cases. But this is a sort of looming problem that, when the pandemic ends, is going to potentially play out in incredibly destructive ways. And this is something that we need to pay close attention to, because the way this is handled is going to be one of the major ways in which sort of broader questions of rights and social rights and property rights within the housing system are settled. I think we can all think of examples in our cities of crisis financialization or of crisis opportunism, where private equity firms, real estate companies, and other financialized actors are buying real estate that is seen as distressed, or preparing to do so, raising huge amounts of capital in order to do so. This is something that's sort of portrayed as this kind of heroic effort to keep real estate values afloat, but we can see how it is really changing patterns of property ownership in many places. There are new formations of urban risk as well, where housing tenures, housing types, relationships between housing tenures and social categories and other locations and social hierarchies are being connected to new forms of risk and precarity. And so this, I think this gets at the whole connection between illness and housing conditions, but also speaking to other issues that are sort of emerging during this pandemic time, such as the connection between pollution and housing as well. I mean, we see that certain types of households are being subjected ever more to certain types of bodily risk. And this is also one of the ways in which the health crisis is shaping housing. Clearly there's been a discussion about this sort of new interfaces between home and work, that this sort of historic separation between home and work is in some ways being run backwards. And so when we're talking about the housing question now, in many ways, we're also talking about work, and we're going to be talking about employment questions. And we need to sort of get a handle on this as we think about new forms of regulation and new politics around work, what it really means to even have a workplace and how it connects to home place. And in general, the health crisis is shaping housing and housing crisis broadly through the inequality that's emerging from it, the so-called K-shaped recovery, where dominant classes are emerging more dominant than ever, and subordinated classes and groups are facing even more difficult times. So this has all sorts of feedback loops within the housing system. At the same time, as I said, there are opportunities for creating a new housing politics here. And I think that there are some aspects of what the pandemic has done to the politics, rhetoric, and culture around housing that is absolutely important. No one now can deny that housing is healthcare. It's obvious to everyone that there's this link between housing and health. It is unmistakable. And I think this just sort of highlights the broader set of privileges and injustices that are wrapped up within the housing question. This is something that everyone knows now. I mean, if you think about the sort of discourse of housing activists, of critical housing academics, and others in the past 20 years, a lot of times people were struggling to sort of make this point that is now part of political common sense. And I think this is quite important. There's also a new politics of public debt. And a lot of the ideas about what debt levels are sustainable have, if not necessarily been thrown out the window, certainly marginalized. And I think people recognize that large amounts of public spending are going to be needed going forward. Even fairly conservative political parties have sort of accepted that. And the sort of Overton window has really shifted about public debt and government spending. And I think this creates quite an opportunity as well. There's also just a new understanding of what's feasible regarding homelessness, regarding eviction moratoria, regarding housing first, regarding many other elements of housing policy. It did not go unnoticed in many cities when the pandemic began, when government essentially said, okay, we are going to just end homelessness for the time being. We're going to put people in hotels, we're going to put people in housing, we're going to get people off the streets because this is an emergency situation. And everyone involved with housing said, well, you could have done this at any point. And I think this is also quite powerful as well, because I think a lot of what people thought of as sort of the limits of public action, the limits of state action, are really not there. It is possible to legislate to end homelessness. It is possible to have a moratorium on evictions. And I think that now that this cat is out of the bag, as it were, we really need to keep it that way and make sure that people realize that, you know, you can't go back to a paradigm where these things are imagined as impossible. Just as an example of the sort of opportunities for new housing policies and politics that have emerged in this exceptional period, think about all of the housing policies around the world that have emerged during this pandemic. I mean, this is just some points that I'm taking from this report called COVID Housing Policy Roundtable that was produced by the Housing Research Collaborative at the University of British Columbia. And I was reading it because I participated in one of the roundtables. But they're sort of summarizing the housing policy response to the pandemic. They identified three general areas. They said that housing policies sought to dampen the spread of COVID-19 through housing-related measures. They sought to improve health outcomes of marginalized communities as a way to respond to the pandemic inequalities. And they've sought to build back better using COVID-19 as a sort of wake-up call to improve adequate housing. In other words, they're things that people have really been asking for a long time, and that have been needed for a long time. But all of a sudden, under these changed political conditions of the health emergency, this became possible. So it's just, you know, we see that the sort of restraints and limits of housing policy have really changed quickly. So all of this is to say that in Europe and elsewhere in the world, there's a renewed need for the establishment of a substantive right to housing, as well as an opportunity to transform the relationship between citizenship and housing. So we really are at this crossroads. So what should a post-pandemic right to housing look like, and how should we pursue it? Again, I'm not going to lay out a platform, but I think we should think about the sort of framing of housing here. I think that there's a real opportunity to use the recovery as a way to transition to a different type of housing system. And especially the way that emergency measures end, I think is going to be very, very important, and really is going to determine the sort of new normal for housing. I mean, thinking about something like an eviction moratorium, you obviously can't just end it cliff end style. That would throw, untold numbers of households into states of insecurity, precarity, and cause untold numbers of evictions. So there needs to be some sort of transition from this emergency period to something else. And I think we really need to think of this as an opportunity to push through non-reformist reforms that will not just repair the status quo ante, but actually establish a new normal, as the saying goes. I think that it is really important to underscore the ways in which rent has been a part of this pandemic and has been a sort of vector of harm throughout this period and has exacerbated the pandemic's impact. And think about how different economically, how different in terms of mortality and disease this pandemic would have been if businesses and households did not sort of face this question of rent. And I think this is an opportunity to really transform the public understanding of rent and the role of rentiers, broadly understood, within political economic life. I mean, a lot of people are pointing to the emergence of a new style of rentier capitalism or rentier society even. And I think that we can sort of flag this as a political problem space in ways that it hasn't been before. There's also a new public understanding of what and who is essential. In cities, in nation states, in families, there's been, I think, a really dramatic new understanding of what matters, what's important. There's also a way to build upon this notion of an essential worker and of essential labor in order to create an actual right to housing. I think this opens the space to new types of political claims, new types of political demands, new types of political logic. And I think that this is something we can build on. And in general, the notion of home has undergone a radical shift politically in the past year. People understand the importance of home and its connection to different elements of economic, social, and political life in such different ways now than they did in January 2020. And this is something also that housing activists and housing researchers have been mobilizing around for many years. And I think finally people understand the central importance of home and its connection to the housing system and to the sort of political economic questions of who gets what within housing and what housing is for. And I think there's the seeds of a new public rationality around housing that can be developed here. As I said, there's also risks that come with this moment. I realize I'm going a bit over my allotted time, and I'll try to be fast here. But I think there's a risk that the recovery will take the shape of a new wave of gentrification and displacement. You already see that being prepared in many places and sort of groundwork for that. The idea that economic recovery means unleashing real estate across the city. This is a real risk, and this is something that those of us involved with housing really need to combat. I think there's the risk of a sort of supercharged phase of financialization, and so any new investments in social housing and any new attempts to bolster and expand social housing will be dwarfed by this newly empowered phase of financialization. There's the risk that pandemic-driven xenophobia and anti-migrant politics are going to be integrated into the housing system. Before the pandemic, this was a major issue, certainly in places like the UK, in Denmark, in the US, and in many other places. And I think that we need to be alert to this risk as well in the ways that this could undermine housing rights. We also need to be alert to the emergence of a new turn towards austerity. There will be massive conflicts between different levels of government going forward over financing, and local governments are deeply cash-strapped, even as national governments are spending unprecedented amounts of money. And this is something that needs to be addressed and attended to. So I think that establishing a post-pandemic right to housing will be one of the central tasks in the recovery and after. But of course, you can't isolate housing from other political and economic issues, and you certainly can't isolate any particular part of the housing system. Establishing a real right to housing will require multi-issue alliances and actions at all scales, from the neighborhood to the municipality to the national and transnational scale. So I'm going to leave it here. Thank you very much for listening. And I think now we're going to go to the Q&A while I...
Thank you, David, for your excellent and very comprehensive analysis and talk. I was really very interesting. I would like to share with you some of the questions that people shared with us. I start with the first one. The David Bodine, sorry for not pronouncing well the name, asks, do you have statistics on the decrease in the production of social housing in Europe during the pandemic? In France, between 10,000 and 20,000 social housing units should be missing by 2020.
That's a very easy question to answer. No, I do not have statistics on this, but this is a very important point to flag. I think that it's not just existing social housing systems have come under strain, but also opportunities to expand social housing have been missed. And I think that's a really important figure and a really powerful point that I think we should all look into. So thank you for that.
The second question is about the key-shaped recovery you mentioned in the speech. Do you have a way to use dormant accounts to leverage to leverage finance for non-profit housing. This is done in France over 100 years, where people's saving via the Livret A used to fund the social housing system.
Yeah, I've heard of this. I've not heard of it as specifically tied to the inequalities in recovery tied to the pandemic. But I mean, certainly it is a source of funding for expanding social housing that people have been discussing. And I mean, I think it's good to draw attention to the passive forms of wealth that have been expanding during this pandemic, and try to imagine ways to harness them for more social needs.
Thanks. And that question was from Sercha Edwards, the director of Housing Europe. And then we have another question from Barbara Steenberger, director of International Union of Tenants. And she asks, eviction moratoria are phased out, rent arrears have been paid now. There is a difference between communication of many governments and the real action. David, what would be your approach to oblige them to continue the progressive policies towards more security of tenure?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on national circumstances, which vary in many places. And I should say that the two housing systems with which I'm most familiar are the UK and the US, neither of which we know are in the EU anymore. I mean, first of all, eviction moratoria are being rolled out, are being ended, and arrears are being treated differently in many different places. And so I think it's sort of hard to generalize. Just, some moratoria are still in place, some are not. I think that the argument about the destructiveness of this sort of wave of post-pandemic evictions has carried the day in many places, and lawmakers have been convinced by this and have sort of recognized that having tens of thousands of people evicted all at once, or at least have the eviction proceedings being begun for tens of thousands of households, is not helpful economically, socially, or politically. So, I mean, I think emphasizing that is important. But there's this, as the question highlights, there's this deeper question of property rights and of the rights of tenants and property owners within the housing system. I don't think there's any sort of magic formula for transforming that, but I do think that there's some sort of space for negotiation now. I mean, the court decision in Karlsruhe last week, I think, sort of speaks to this to some extent about the rent cap in Berlin, and sort of shows that it's not as if it's an entirely pro-tenant political environment right now. But I do think there's sort of space for all the reasons that I described in the talk to sort of renegotiate the sort of overall settlement between property owners and property inhabitants.
Thanks. I just moved to the next question by Doris Andoni, General Director of National Housing Agency in Albania. People understand the importance of home for their own families, but what is the importance to understand the importance of housing as a public interest? This would allow the use of public money for providing the needed social and affordable housing. Can you have a role in making housing to be considered as a public good interest?
It's also a great question. And I mean, it does point to one of the sort of asymmetries of housing politics, that everyone does sort of see the questions around justice in their own household and really regards infringements upon the household as an injustice, but that doesn't necessarily translate into an appreciation of the social role of housing, the public role of housing. But again, I do think the pandemic has sort of shaken up our understandings of the relationship between public and private. I mean, if you think about public health measures, which always sort of hit upon this line and try to move it, that are asking people to change their private behavior for essentially public or sort of social reasons. If you think about ways in which the pandemic is reported and problematized, where questions of sort of the private good and the public good are really intertwined strongly. I do think that it would be possible to sort of keep this conversation going to some extent and to politicize it, to mobilize around continuing to understand housing as always a political question, always a public question, even when it's privately owned. It still has public consequences. I think that people understand this now in a better way, and I think it should be possible for housing movements and housing reformers to build on that. I mean, it's interesting that this time when people aren't allowed to gather in many places has still been one that's been deeply contentious and deeply politicized. And the sort of COVID city has been one that has seen really remarkable and sort of history-making levels of protest. Housing movements have not been at the forefront of this, even though housing has been one of the major issues. So I do think that a lot of activists that I know are sort of mobilizing now and trying to sort of keep the housing question at the forefront of people's minds as societies begin to emerge from this issue, from this pandemic. And I think that that's really important to try to speak to these questions about public, private, about property, about inhabitants, and etc.
Thank you. That's very interesting point on how to, point at socializing the meaning of the private property as well. I think they would need more research and analysis and discussion around this. This is very, I think, an interesting aspects to cover. There are many questions that are just coming up. I summarized them a little bit, if the people don't mind. So we have one question by Defonso de Garcia, who's looking at if the 2030 schedule has established changes to face COVID in each of the 17 SOD. How do you think this recommendation can affect the urban schedule? That's the first question. And the other one, which is by Ivan Tosic, URBACT experts, is the recovery and resilient facility is a massive funding, but it's mostly oriented on climate change and digital goals, not mentioning social aims. Which money could be spent? So what is the contrast between the massive investment and the lack of the social aims? And then I look at the last one. Aldous Vargas from National Urban Point in Poland says, who should take responsibility for a new kind of post-pandemic housing? The experience in Poland has been one of the assaulted private developers that had received a green light to build large estates in places where there was no place for them. And you can read the rest of the questions in the chat if you want.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, thanks for that. I mean, I think these are all questions about political authority within the housing system going forward, and questions about power in the housing system, and questions about the place of social housing within the housing system as well. I've been sort of trying to articulate this argument that we're at a crossroads, and it is possible to move to a different sort of paradigm where the state will no longer be constantly trying to either roll itself back or sort of marketize itself and act more like a private developer, where social housing expansion is no longer seen as politically unfeasible. Even before the pandemic, you did see the sort of emergence of this kind of approach. I mean, in London, which has really pioneered a lot of privatization and neoliberal housing policies over the decades, a year or two ago, people were saying the biggest sort of trend in local government was insourcing, and was councils and local authorities trying to reverse outsourcing, trying to become involved in housing and other aspects of urban development in new ways again. Some of these remained quite sort of market oriented as well, and instead of seeing councils build actual social housing, that you saw councils acting like property developers for private housing. But I think it does point to, as I said, a sort of changing political logic and changing institutional form that can be built upon. I mean, there's no way to sort of guarantee that it'll take one shape or another, but I think it is important to sort of emphasize that there are sort of routes open to an increased public role, routes open to new social housing and new public housing, I think in ways that they had not been open before. I don't know if this sort of answers these questions, some of which are kind of technical questions, I think, about this specific housing initiative. But the point I want to make is that there is, I think, the sort of possibility of a new housing model being developed now, and it really does come down to these questions about sort of power and rights within the housing system.
Thank you, David, for this positive message on the possibilities for the future. I would like to thank you warmly for sharing your reflection with us. I think it's been extremely interesting, and these are food for thoughts that we also will develop further in the platform, and we populate the platform with additional inputs from you or from other people who will be happy to contribute. Just to close this conversation, I want to mention the input from Housing Europe that has been sustaining this initiative for in many different occasions. Alice Pittini, the researcher in Housing Europe, says that they are monitoring the production of social housing, and the production has not decreased dramatically yet in 2020 in many countries, but the sector fears not being able to keeping up production in the future, as revenues for rents are increasingly at risk. Plus, experts are already warning that demand for social housing will increase, and evidence is still scattered, but for instance, council housing waiting lists in England already count 1.1 million households and could be set to nearly double to 2 million households next year. Other informations are in the chat, and I would suggest everyone to keep writing questions if David or whoever willing to answer, and also to share initiatives that we can also put on the platform or reports or any other information that is related to our today's discussion. And I leave the floor to Nuala Morgan from URBACT for the next part. Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, David, for this really thought-provoking speech. You highlighted that 2 directions are possible in the road out of this pandemic, and also the importance of the different levels of governments. Cities, of course, have certain levers for action, although they cannot tackle everything alone. We'll have 2 cities here who I think we can say are on the road of deepening their commitment to the right to housing. And I'll present them to you just now. Our work over this past year has focused on cities engaging in the right to housing, and URBACT and UIA joining forces has allowed us to discover the more innovative and cutting-edge actions that cities have been experimenting with, alongside the tried and tested methods of integrated and participative approaches that have been improved through European cooperation. So I'm delighted to welcome 2 cities here today to share their experience with us, Ghent in Belgium and Lisbon in Portugal. And while you're listening to their presentations, you can use the Q&A tool to continue asking your questions to them. I'll come to Ghent in just a moment, but first I'd like to introduce Flores Bella Pinto, who is representing Paula Marques here today, Deputy Mayor of Lisbon for Housing and Local Development. Unfortunately, Paula had an unforeseen matter that prevented her from attending, but Flores Bella works in Paula's cabinet on housing, and I'm really glad you could make it today, Paula. Sorry, Flores Bella. So Paula Marques welcomed URBACT to Lisbon in 2018 for a city festival. And at that time, she spoke of the municipalist movement, of the importance of cities and communities coming together to boost their power in a globalized world. And in relation to housing in particular, she targeted the impact of deregulating housing markets in 2012, coupled with the tourism influx that's contributing to gentrification. So Flores Bella, can you tell us about Lisbon's story of housing and what strategies you have put in place to push the right to housing in Lisbon? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Noala. Thank you, everyone. And yes, I can share a little bit of our experience. I don't know if I can share a PowerPoint, a small presentation just to support.
Okay, my colleague is going to give you the opportunity to share your screen so you can show some slides. Yes.
Okay.
You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay.
If you see at the bottom of your screen, the share screen option.
Yeah. Can you see the presentation, the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you, Florestella.
Okay. Okay. So first, I would like to thank URBACT and Urban Innovation Actions for this invitation. For us, in the last few years, it has been very important to have a network of forum where we could discuss this kind of problematics. As David Madden also said, it is a crisis that started a few years and that has been growing in the last 20 years. In the case of Lisbon, we always had a shortage of affordable housing, namely in the rent area. So because for many years buying a house was the solution for most people, but feeling this crisis, Lisbon created a local housing program that basically is a plan to achieve greater social cohesion and to attract more population, but improve the quality of life and the quality of the housing in the city. So here you can see in the slide some of the missions and goals that the municipality put forward to, in a space of 10 years, to achieve more affordable housing. And one of the ways we tried to do that was to give priority to rehabilitation, because at that time we had a great number of buildings that were vacant and in need of rehabilitation. But from this moving from crisis to opportunity, what we achieved at a point where we have seen that the most of the rehabilitation that was promoted in the market was to respond to short-term leases and to tourism-related projects. And so we started to feel greater pressure and the increase in demand for the municipal housing projects. Just to give you a little overview of what is the social housing panorama in Lisbon. So there are around about almost 22,000 public houses in public neighborhoods. And at this moment, to respond to an increase in yearly new applicants for municipal housing, that at this point is around 2,500 demands per year. We started a project to build or rehabilitate around about 7,000 new units in the city in different territories. And for that, we made use not only of the public housing and terrains that we had, but also buying new buildings and constructing from scratch to achieve this 7,000 units project. The major strategic housing programs we have right now are thought to address several housing needs. So besides the social rent municipal housing, we have an affordable rent program that is thought for people that have an income, a basic income that doesn't allow, that leaves them out of the social municipal housing. That is for the especially thought for the persons, for the families that have low income. And also, we support solutions for transitional housing, namely for homelessness and victims of violence, refugees, and also some elderly adapted solutions, because Lisbon, as many other cities, also has been seeing a shift in the demographics, and so this is also an area that we need to address. Also, we have the municipal lease subsidy that is a way to prevent one of the phenomena that David talked earlier, that is the pressure over tenants that are in premium areas to leave those places. So the subsidy is a way we found to subsidize the increase in rents in those areas. Also, the new construction, as I told you about, the renewal of the municipal districts, improving accessibility, mobility, public space. Also, secure rent income. That is, with this pandemic, we saw a decrease of tourism. I think is an issue that probably we saw also all over the world. But we tried to shift to an opportunity that was to profit from the fact that there were a lot of buildings that were vacant because of the lack of tourism, and invite the proprietaries to rent the housing directly to the municipality, and the municipality would rent these houses at an affordable price for the persons that are seeking affordable housing. So this is another way to shift from crisis to opportunity, and try to bring also the market into a solution that will benefit all those that are looking for affordable houses in the city. Also, at some point, because of the dynamics of the rapid dynamics of the tourism in the city, we as a municipality also adapted the licensing aspect of it, putting limits in zones with a major pressure in terms of short rental projects in the city, so that for on one side we could distribute these kinds of projects around the city, and not only on focalized zones where we would risk to have a lack of housing for those residents, and at the same time promote this dispersion of economical dynamic throughout the city overall. This these questions that the crisis we are, sorry. Okay. So as a municipality, what the main thing that we want to pass is that we cannot address this issue as a city if we don't have the right to housing as the main driver for this change. And one of the aspects that are essential for this to happen is to have the legislative support to achieve this objective. Because as a city, we can do so much. So at our scale, we are trying to respond with several programs to resolve issues on several areas. But at the same time, if we don't have the law, and in Portugal, I'll reference to this because in Portugal we have a national housing law that was put in place, and that helps also to achieve this right to housing goal. So I imagine that other cities like Lisbon will be also missing this kind of legal framework to advance this objective. So I think in the networks that we've been collaborating and thinking about this affordable housing issues, it's one of the things I think at international level or European level, it should be thought about what kind of legislation can we have to support this affordable housing in Europe overall. And on the other side also, David touched a little bit about that question, is the financial aspect. How are we able to increase this affordable housing demand if the resources that we have, depending on the size of the city or the country, each one has a different reality, but the lack of financial support is also a problem. So we need to think that in order to put in place this right to housing, there is a public commitment that needs to be forward, and there is an investment that is essential to achieve this social commitment of housing. As someone already said, public housing is only one of the ways we can promote affordable housing, but we need to have all stakeholders in partnership to achieve an equilibrium in this objective, because cities that don't preserve and don't defend their citizens that need to work, need to study, need to have mobility. If we don't defend those housing rights, we will have cities that are completely discharacterized and won't be able to achieve a quality of life that is desirable. So this is the message that I wanted to leave. It is extremely important, the networking that we are doing with other cities that are feeling the same problems. It is important to reflect, it is important to share experiences and the ways of each city are dealing and finding solutions towards this housing crisis.
Yes.
And I think,
sorry, Bella. Yeah, no, I think that's a very clear message. maybe I'll just ask you to wrap up now so that we can take up those points also in the next panel.
Okay, so that's basically it. So if anyone has any question, they can ask, and if you want information about also the housing programs that we have a website, and I suppose also your platform will share some of this experiences. It's really good to have a unique portal to all this information, because information is power, and we can advance in that way.
That's a very clear point, Flores Bella. Thank you so much for outlining the actions that you've taken in Lisbon, and of course, as you say, the political will and the strategic vision is there to go in that direction. But yes, the points on having this national framework to act. And also the ability and the capacity to finance those actions are really important, and I think they'll certainly be taken up in the next panel with our other speakers. So thanks, Flores Bella. Please have a look in the chat and see if there's any Q&As for you to answer there. I turn now to the city of Ghent, and I welcome Derkien de Bits, who works for the Housing Service. So that's part of the Department of Urban Development. Ghent, we know, is very active in European projects also. We've already mentioned the roof network that financed by URBACT that some of your colleagues are leading, tackling homelessness using the Housing First model. So that case study is presented on the platform in the form of a short video. But today we're focusing with you on the innovative approaches in Ghent that you're testing to improve the quality of affordable housing in the city. So Derkien, you're a project manager for the Icarus project. So I'll hand over to you. You can tell us about your approach to housing in Ghent and the challenges that you're facing. And of course, we want to hear about this innovative tools that you're using. Derkien.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I will try to answer these questions based on my experience as a project manager of Icarus, which focuses on vulnerable homeowners, but I will also try to include some general points on the housing crisis in Ghent. So first of all, let me give you some context about Ghent. It's the third largest city of Belgium with approximately 260,000 inhabitants, and as many other European cities, there is a lack of affordable housing for low-income groups. First of all, the waiting lists for social housing are long and they keep on growing. 11% of the households in Ghent is renting a social housing unit, which is higher than the average in Belgium, but that amount is still not sufficient for the demand. More than 10,000 people are waiting on a waiting list for several years. Secondly, the private rental market is very narrow and the housing quality is low, making the value for money also very low on the rental market. And on top of that, a lot of the rental houses are actually occupied by students, making the amount of available units lower and the prices higher. So, and as a result of all those factors, the affordability in Ghent is low and the homelessness in Ghent is also rising. So those are definitely some barriers that the city is experiencing, but we have some clear actions to tackle these issues, mainly focusing on the social housing and on a qualitative rental market. So first of all, the most clearly related to the right of housing is the roof urban network that was set up to end homelessness based on the Housing First principle, as you already mentioned. And then secondly, we are really trying to increase the amount of social housing units as a main focus point of the policy plan on housing, which is obviously a long-term project. And then thirdly, there's also a focus on expanding the number of units and improving the quality of the rental market and offering alternative housing for students. But at the same time, and now I come closer to Icarus, the home ownership is very common in Belgium and the loan charges are quite low. So a lot of people go to great lengths to buy a house just because there are no alternatives on the rental or social market. And then they buy a house, but the housing stock in Ghent is old. Most of the more affordable houses are 19th century workmen's houses, so they are low in quality and absolutely not energy efficient. There are some support tools to encourage renovation, such as grants, subsidies, tax reductions, but these are not accessible for low-income owners because they always require a pre-investment of the owner before the grant application can be submitted. So it's mainly the middle class who can benefit from these incentives and not the vulnerable homeowners. Next slide, please. So this results in another barrier. A lot of those homeowners just manage to buy a small affordable house, but then they don't have the means or the skills to renovate those houses, and they stay kind of stuck in unsafe substandard houses with very high energy costs. We estimate that there are something like 6,000 homeowners in Ghent that find themselves in that situation. We call them captive owners, and they are the target group of the Icarus project. So the main admission criteria for our project is that the participants can only have one house, they have a limited income, and the house is not compliant with the Flemish housing code. This code sets the minimal standards of safety and quality for houses in Flanders. But all these houses could be renovated with 30,000 euros. So all the participants, they get a social and a technical counselor throughout the entire project. The technical counselor is in charge of the renovation, and the social counselor is there for social, emotional, financial, and practical support along the way. And they also try to use Icarus project as a starting point to make improvements on other domains by proactively looking for rights and social services that are available for them, but perhaps are not used yet. Next slide, please. And then the most innovative part about Icarus is the way the renovation is financed. So Icarus uses a recurring fund. Per dwelling, we assign a repayable contribution of maximum 30,000 euros, and this is used to cover the renovation costs. But this contribution is not a loan. It has to be paid back when the house is alienated. So when it's sold, when the owner dies, then at that point it has to be paid back, which means that people can benefit from this contribution their entire life if they want to. And then if the value of the house is higher when it is sold than it was at the beginning of the project, plus the inflation, then a part of that capital gain will be divided between the owner and the public center of social welfare. And then whenever 20 contributions and a part of the capital gain are paid back, a new renovation wave can be set up. Therefore, the public investment funds can be used over and over again to tackle the housing quality of low-income owners. This implies quite a complex collaboration between different departments and also a long-term commitment of the public center of social welfare, as they have to take and lift mortgages on the houses, which could take 40 or 50 years. And another more complex element is that there are two deputy mayors involved in the project. So we have assembled joint deputy mayor meetings in order to let everything run smoothly. So to sum it up, Icarus improves the housing quality, the security of tenure, and also the energy efficiency of the houses of captive owners in Ghent. Therefore, it is an important action to accomplish the objectives of the renovation wave as part of the European Green Deal. And I would like to take this opportunity to stress that there need to be specific tools and supports in order to make those energy efficient renovations available for vulnerable and low-income homeowners. Not only the investment funds are important, but there also need to be sufficient social and technical guidance in order to bring the renovations to a successful conclusion. So we're sure that this is not a problem that only occurs in Ghent. It's probably a problem that many other European countries face as well. So we would like to call on the European government to provide support for all these vulnerable citizens who could play a vital role in the renovation wave, but just can't afford to carry out these much needed energy efficient renovations. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dirk-Jan. That was a really I think interesting insight into especially this innovation tool that you're using, and I'm sure there'll be some questions in the Q&A for other participants to really understand that mechanism. So have a look in the chat and see if there are any questions there for you. Again, I think some comments that that can possibly be taken up in the next panel by Laura on the role of the EU level, again, in supporting these approaches. And we heard again the particular role of financing, and also in terms of targeting this financing also to these social renovations. So thank you, Derkin. Thank you, Flores Bella, for your presentations. We've heard from these two cities today on your political and technical approaches, and you can find, of course, more examples on the platform that we've just launched today. But I'll hand over to Laura now, who's going to examine in the next panel these questions of national and EU support crucial for the right to housing. Thank you again, and over to you, Laura.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nuala. And I just want to say that the example, the story of the Derkin just presented, the case study, will be also on the platform, is a UIA project, and there will be similar cases as the one of the Ghent available online. Okay, so next step. So we are reaching out to the national and the European level. European level with happy to have with us MEP Kieran Kufe, if I'm pronouncing well your name, Kieran. She's a member of European Parliament for Dublin with the Green Parties. It sits on the Energy and Transport Committees of the Parliament and serves as a president of EU Forests, a European NGO that promotes the deployment of renewable energy resources and energy efficiency. He's also an architect and planner at the graduated London School of Economics, and we are very happy to have you with us. And the second speaker of today is Nuno Serra. Hi, Nuno. Is also a master in human geography from the University of Coimbra, and he's a researcher at the SAGE, the Center for Social Studies. And he developed work in the areas of the state, social policies, and housing policies. And we invited you especially for your current role as advisor to the Minister of Infrastructure and Housing in Portugal, key role during the Portuguese presidency. So I would like to start with Kieran saying a year following the outbreak of the pandemic, we have the adoption of the access to decent and affordable housing for all by the European Parliament in the 21st of January. And this is, we all agree that represents a major achievement, but can you please shed some light in your understanding what needs to be done next?
I can, of course, and thanks for the invitation to be with you today. And just listening to the last two speakers, to Flores Bella Pinto from Lisboa and to hear Derkin from Ghent, those stories are very familiar to me coming from Dublin, Ireland, where I guess due to political inaction and also the success of the Irish economy, we have a continued housing crisis with 15,000 people on the waiting lists in the city of Dublin alone, and an estimate says that we won't clear the waiting lists for another 30 years. So the crisis is real and it is profound. And globalization is taking its toll. International capital is going into Airbnb, student housing, hotels, and the latest iteration is co-living, where you live in a room the size smaller than a parking space and share a kitchen with perhaps 40 other people. So let there be no doubt about it. There are real challenges at a global level when it comes to the supply of affordable and decent housing. So you mentioned the pandemic, and a year ago, as the pandemic brought shockwaves around the world and in Europe, people said, Europe must act and you need to coordinate and manage the health response to the crisis. But health was not and is not a European competency. It is a national, regional, and local competency. And despite the best will in the world, the European Commission and the European Parliament was not able to completely manage the pandemic. It was left up to national and regional governments. And in the same way, the housing crisis that we see in both rich and poor countries is mainly a national and a local competency. At a European Union level, we can talk about it, we can write reports about it, we can bang the table and say this needs to happen, but don't think that we have all the buttons that we can push to instantly deliver housing at a municipal level. So it is quite frustrating as a parliamentarian at a European level to be consumed by the challenge of housing, but to realize that our powers are quite limited. Nonetheless, my Green colleague Kim van Sparentak's report on access to decent and affordable housing for all is an important contribution. It says the housing crisis is real and it's becoming harder for vulnerable groups such as people with physical or psychiatric disabilities to get housing. And it's difficult for people from marginalized communities, whether it be Roma or traveler groups in my own country. And we are seeing social exclusion and spatial segregation. Spatial segregation, it's a confusing phrase, but in my own city, it means young couples are saying, I cannot afford to live in Dublin. I will find a home 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 kilometers away, and I will commute by car every day into Dublin. So it's bad for people's social life, it's bad for the planet, and it contributes to the crisis. So while housing is not a direct European competence, we can speak out. And I think the fact that Kim's report had an overwhelming majority from the Parliament, it showed that there is political ambition there, which we now need to put into practice. Secondly, access to housing is a fundamental right that is guaranteed at a European level by the Social Charter. It's now part of the European Pillar of Social Rights. So that is an important framework that we can bring back to our cities and towns. Thirdly, I think we do need a new fiscal rule book that will allow for more public investment in affordable, social and energy efficient housing. Traditionally, that has been an obstacle. You can't spend too much money, you're exceeding the fiscal rules. So I think there is a push to change that at a European level. We need to keep pushing that through the European Union budget and through the economic recovery. And speaking of the economic recovery, at a European level, we have this huge amount of money that is going to be put into the recovery and resilience plans. They are due in by the end of next week, by the end of April. And we have pushed very strongly for housing to be at the heart of these recovery plans. Why? Because it generates jobs, it tackles social inequities, it can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it can create local jobs, so it can bring people out of poverty. So creating housing is a win-win, and the Parliament will have oversight of these recovery and resilience plans, and I certainly will be pushing for a major housing component in them. Also at a European level, we want to see a European Union framework for national homelessness. We have different indicators, different rules, different criteria across the 27 member states. And if we can have a common methodology or framework to examine homelessness, it'll give us good data, and good data is the start of real strong responses. I wrote a report that complements Kim's report on housing. My report was on building renovations and the renovation wave. So we do need to spend, I said, about 75 billion a year from the EU on renovations over the next 30 years. That will improve the quality of accommodation, as we saw in Ghent earlier. And there is a commitment to funding renovation from a European level. And that will improve the quality of our housing stock. It's good for climate, it's good for jobs, and it gets people out of energy poverty, which is a huge issue for 10%, at least 10% of European Union households. Couple of final points. In my own country, we are committing, the Greens are in government, and we've got a commitment to a referendum on housing. There's a lot of discussion as to what that means. Is it a right to housing? Is it the availability of housing? Those rows continue, but if you can put it in the Constitution, it helps. So the more we can talk about housing as a right, as a necessity, the better it is. And then just a last point, arising from that work on renovation, I've been sitting on a working group of the World Economic Forum looking at the finance for housing renovations. But it's become really clear to me from the European Investment Bank, from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, from the European Central Bank, and from all these big equity providers, the banks, the Blackstones, the huge global entities, they are saying very clearly, we have the money and we want to put it into areas where we have a guaranteed rate of return. They were saying that in regard to building renovations, but you could just as well say that about providing housing. There's nowhere for this money to go. The rate of return is low when you pop it out into bonds or into other financial instruments, and housing is a guaranteed return. So I think we have to make that case much stronger in our municipalities, in our countries, and at a European level. A good place to invest in is housing. The phrase in English, safe as houses, is no accident. It is a guaranteed return, and we need to put that demand front and center, both in the European Parliament and at a municipal level. I leave it at that, and I really enjoyed the contribution so far and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you very much, Tian. I would like to pick some of the words that you said that I think were key in the conversation and also leading to the next speaker. So you talk about that we are consumed by the challenge of housing because politically speaking, because also the decision making is not in the hands of completely in the hands of the European level, and the role of national level is crucial. But also you said that there is political ambition, and it's a particular moment also in relation, thanks for mentioning the European Pillar of Social Rights. And changing the fiscal rule. And the other aspect that we didn't stress enough until now, it's that also looks at the European report of Kim, you were saying, on the on homelessness, and looking at a similar way of analyzing the phenomenon and data. I think Fianza did a lot of work on that with the ethos light analysis, and I think that that can be something that should be picked up and considered. But the particular aspect you were saying is that there is political ambition and the European Pillar of Social Rights, which are, I think, at the core of the mandate or at the core of the discussion of the Portuguese presidency. Nuno, you are a researcher, you are an advisor, so you're not sitting at the table of decision makers. We understand that, but what is your position? What is your understanding of the meaning, or also political meaning of the Portuguese presidency in our discussion? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. I'd like to start by thanking the Urban Innovative Actions and URBACT, and particularly Laura and Emily and Alice for the invitation to be here. It's an honor for me, and it's been a very, very interesting session. And I would like to say 2 or 3 things that maybe help us with the ambition all we have about the housing policies. I would like first to highlight in the title of this webinar and in the title of this session 2 ideas. The first is the idea of housing as a human and social right, and the idea of commitment and long term. And this is important because we are trying to put housing policies at the level of European Union. And for that is also important to remember that it was after the post-World War II that the welfare states emerged in Europe. I mean the welfare state as an institutional expression of the recognition at the nation-state level of universal social rights such as health, education, housing, or social protection. And this is a commitment marked by the creation and expanding of public systems of response to those social rights. And remember also that the welfare state means, by the social contract it contains itself, not only in terms of provision of these public services, but also as a model of regulation between capital and labor. And that was an important inspiration to what we often call the European social model. But here, an important point. This expression, European social model, is maybe the less developed dimension of the European project and the European integration process. Secondly, it seems to me also important to highlight that housing policy represents, in the set of the main social policies, and even in countries that promoted a significant public housing sector, one of the areas less achieved and more vulnerable to crisis, especially when we compare housing with other areas like health or education, which the public systems are more stronger and more capable to avoid crisis. In fact, both from a budgetary point of view and in terms of results, we are dealing with a certain secondary level social policy, the housing, in most of the member states, and particularly in countries that later created its welfare states, like Portugal, Greece, or Spain. More recently, all we know, with the decline of housing policies in most of the countries, linked to the process of financialization of housing and the reduction of public spending on the sector, and also by the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, the housing crisis has been strongly intensified. Like as the most recent report, Housing Europe, underlines, the average rental price has increased by around 15% in the past decade in the European Union, and around 30% in the case of residential houses transactions. At the level of the member states, the decline in housing policies and in terms of direct promotion is impressive. Countries traditionally with universalistic policies, like Netherlands, Denmark, or Sweden, have been increasingly adopting generalist policies. I mean, focused on the neediest groups and cases of difficult to access to houses which prices are compatible with the household incomes. And this at the same time with countries with generalistic policies advancing for residual policies of housing. So we have assisted in the last years and decades to a loss of importance of housing in terms of welfare system. The problem today, almost everywhere, is that housing shortages are not limited to situations of poverty or homeless. The need for accessible housing also affects the middle classes themselves in very different countries. And that means that nowadays the constitutional recognition in many countries and the recurrent proclamations of the right to housing for all are an eloquent example of the difference between law in books and law in action. Because over the last time, housing policies prioritized market logics under the wrong assumption that today we know this very well. Once on its own, the market would solve all the problems of access to housing. And we know by the experience of the last decade that this is not true. With the pandemic, what the pandemic crisis exposes, therefore, is a precedent housing crisis, much deeper and more structural than the crisis that came with the pandemic. A crisis of overcrowded homes and overburdened rate costs, for example. And that must lead us to not only to rethink the role of the state at the national and local level, and particularly in cities at the local level, but also at the level of the European Union. A role of the state that necessarily involves the strengthening of direct promotion of houses and the cooperation with cooperative movements and other organizations of the third sector. In order to revitalize and the consequent lasting way, perdurable politics, the idea of housing as a human and social right, as suggests and very well this conference. That's why the initiative of the European Pillar of Social Rights is very timely, but is also very, very important, and I would like to underline this, that the scope of this initiative goes beyond the minimalistic approach inscribed at the principle 19, essentially focused on solving the situation of greatest need and vulnerability. We need a policy for several segments of social demand. More ambitious, it seems to me, in fact, the many of the proposals worked in recent years, and namely from the URBACT network and the Urban Innovative Actions Initiative, as well the ones at the level of European Parliament related with the access to decent and affordable housing for all. And finally, the recommendations of the Housing Europe network in its most recent report published this year. In line with these proposals, the European Union commitment to housing policy should effectively be applied in a concrete framework of direct and indirect support for public investment on affordable housing. I think this is one of the objectives in our demand for a more participation of the European Union and its institutions on the housing problem. By reducing, for example, the share of national co-participation in communitary funds for the sector, and reviewing in a favorable way the state aid clause and safeguarding the investment clause at the Stability and Growth Pact within the scope of public promotion. Public promotion is, for me, a key for solving the problem. But we also need, obviously, a reinforced market regulation in the dynamics of transactions and prices, and with a clear advances in systems of information and knowledge to better assess public policies. Advances that will allow us to do a better monitorization of the situation, of the needs, and the conditions to promote the access to decent and accessible houses for all. And all these must be reflected in European communitary funds, and namely at the next financial framework for 2021-2027. We are beginning a long way to go because the housing question is very delayed in Europe in the Union. It's a path that will not be easy to do, all we know that. We are in the beginning of a process that demands for continued efforts at all the scales. And I would like to underline this. Not only, and the scale of state-nation still is very, very important. I hope that the resilience and recovery plan also becomes an important step in this way. It's anyway a long way in which the active participation of cities, which have the more direct contact with the problems and the needs, but also with the more innovative answers and approaches, is unavoidable. And
sorry. I would be sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
We need to wrap up because we are a bit delayed, and so if you can close your.
I'm really finished. Okay. It's also a path that still demands the role of the states at the scale at the nation state, which is the natural scale, I must remember, until today, of the welfare state, both internally and in relationship with European institutions. All these scales and actors are necessary for that the right to decent and affordable houses becomes, in fact, a reality for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot. Thank you. Sorry for speeding up a little bit.
No
State
problem.
aid, close, reinforced market regulation, and many other things that you put on the table. So I hope that they will be taken on board in the next days of the Portuguese presidency. I give the floor right away to Maria Hapaca. Maria is working at DG Regio, and she has been a member of the EU Urban Agenda affordable housing coordinated by Vienna, Michaela Kauer. And I give you the floor, Maria, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks for organizing this event and the collaborative work you have been engaging into last year. Who would have thought when when you launched this action in Porto in January 2020 that how important the housing issue and the home actually became with the different aspects that you have all brought forward also today. So thank you for that. It's also a key moment that you have carried on talking about the housing topic, because it's indeed, like you said, in between the two programs, also programming periods, and when member states and cities are currently programming for the starting budget period, because we are also discussing cohesion policy budget here accompanying the policy. So the issue is important to keep in the discussion and transfer your experience and knowledge about it. So thank you for that. Yes, it's not the end of it, this capitalization. You have been running now the first URBACT UIA capitalization project, and this will continue in future, and the aim is to even systematize the transfer of knowledge and projects from UIA with the help of URBACT and other systems. URBACT has throughout the years already addressed in a very good way different aspects of housing and the social components and citizen involvement. So both sides have a lot of experience already, and this work has also brought nicely the, like you said, urban agenda partnerships that addressed the housing issue through various working groups and actions. Yes, from the cohesion policy side, where also the innovative actions is hosted, the European Urban Initiative will continue and aim to address coherence in the different urban initiatives and support that we have had so far, and closely cooperating with the future URBACT program, URBACT 4, in the coming years. The green, digital and just transition were mentioned several times today. That will also very much guide our action in this area and in whole cohesion policy, of course, and that will also bring opportunities in supporting housing from different perspectives. Cohesion policy logic works through policy objectives. The focus, for example, of very relevance for this area is on green and environmental aspects and thematic concentration in that area. So this is self-evident that in energy renovation, energy poverty issues, circular economy, in general climate action, where we foresee 30% of the policy would be allocated indicatively, would be relevant. In addition, we have a direct objective addressing local level and cities, where 8% of the future regional development fund will be allocated through integrated strategies at urban level, addressing local economic, environmental and social aspects, and for example, which allows to address the negative effects of concentration like urban sprawl, traffic congestion, affordable housing, poverty issues like that. And of course, the European social pillar that from the urban development perspective complements the measures, and in its own right also addresses social inclusion aspects, and in the area of housing, the inclusion of disadvantaged groups and marginalized people. What is in parallel happening, and that is partly also because of the discussion where you are involved through the past years, the new initiatives, the renovation wave you have mentioned today, and under that the affordable housing initiative and the Bauhaus will in parallel keep this discussion and importance on the first line, and cohesion policy is indeed the first and biggest policy to support the implementation and delivery of the renovation wave. And we also consider that the social aspects are important to include there too. So this all comes together through the different objectives and through the cohesion policy goals. There are many possibilities to address the housing issue, and here we are in cooperation with the member states and cities that are programming their funding. There is no one way of addressing and programming these issues. It's very much depending on the policy priorities and focus in each country, how much different aspects are emphasized through cohesion policy specifically, but the possibilities are there.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have many Q&A that are still coming, and there is no time, unfortunately. We also took a little bit more time than planned to answer all of that. People would like to have more information about the plans of Portuguese presidency and have other additional information, but maybe we can pick them up and try and make sure that these answers will be provided. I would like to give the floor to Raffaele Barbato, who opened this session, the webinar of today from UIA, for the closing remark, and thank you very much from my side to everyone who contributed.
Thanks, Laura. Indeed, we are quite late in time, but I think this is a sign of the richness of the different contributions that we had the chance to hear today. So yeah, I will just closing it with a few thanks on my behalf, but also on behalf of the URBACT Secretariat. And my first thanks goes to you, Laura. And this is because I think that with your highly competent, but also passionate commitment, you have been a real mastermind and pillar of this activity. And you have been also the one constantly pushing us and challenging us in order to have such an openness and diversity of perspective and point of view, which I believe has been highly beneficial for this activity. My thanks, of course, goes also to the two extraordinary and amazing teams at URBACT, so Alice, Noalia, but at UIA as well, Amélie and Ophélie in particular. It goes to the web developers who made a great job to put together the platform. It goes warmly to all the organizations that you have been mentioning, Laura, at the beginning, from Eurocities to Housing Europe, FEANZA, Fondation Abbé Pierre, OECD, who have been contributing actively to this capitalization activity. And it goes to all the speakers, ad hoc experts that have been contributing as well. So I will just closing, stressing some word that Maria already said, just to say that, of course, this is not the end of the story. The purpose of the platform is to stay there, to stay live, to keep inspiring cities and urban stakeholders in Europe, but also to keep collecting and gathering knowledge, initiative ideas regarding the right to housing in Europe and beyond. So this is everything from my side. I thank you all participants for your attention, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.